Hi everyone, it's Debra at Laurie's Country Cottage. Thanks for attending Schoolhouse 2021. My session today is going to deal with hand stitching. Lately we've noticed in the store a resurgence in the interest of hand stitching, whether you're doing English paper piecing, you're doing some embroidery work, or the wool stitcheries that we've got into the store recently. My purpose today is to help you make that task of hand stitching a little more enjoyable by making it a little easier and maybe even a little speedier. Won't you join me? So one of the most important things when hand stitching is actually your choice of needle. There are about 4 or more factors that are going to affect which is the needle that's best for your particular project. Just want to take a look at these 2 darning needles that I have here just because they exaggerate my first point. And my first point is talking about what is the point on your needle. Is it a blunt end that's going to need to be able to just pierce a very loosely woven or loosely knit textile? Or is it a pointy end that's going to help you pierce the fabric wherever you want to? That's an important thing. So you'll notice in the store that we have eyes that have a point and don't have a point. And for embroidery work and for hand stitching, usually you're going to want a needle with a good sharp point. So you're going to aim toward embroidery needles and sharps that have that sharp point. You might then consider the gauge of the needle or the thickness of the metal that the needle has been manufactured. I always try to go for the smallest needle that I can easily thread when I'm doing my particular project. So if I'm just hand stitching, say, the binding of a quilt, then I'm just going to take a sharp needle and I'm going to take a fairly fine needle and use it to stitch through because it will pass through that tightly woven quilting cotton. But if I'm doing embroidery, it's going to depend on how many threads I want to thread through the eye of my needle. So I prefer the 9 and 10 embroidery needles because they are fine, their eyes are big enough for me to thread up to 3 strands, and they're going to allow me to make really fine, precisely placed stitches. Embroidery needles, however, come in a variety of sizes, and so if you're finding that the 9 and the 10s are too small, get yourself a package of a variety pack like the 3 to 9s. The 3 to 9 has a range of needles, and then you'll be able to match it to the particular project that you're doing. Do remember that for hand stitching needles, the bigger the number, the narrower the gauge of the needle, the finer the metal in the needle itself, all right? When I'm doing really super fine work, like stitching my English paper piecing hexagons together, I want to make the finest, tiniest stitches that I can, catching just a few hairs at the edge of my bound paper piece. And so I really like these gold eye needles that are super fine. These would actually be appropriate for applique, for beadwork, and for my English paper piecing. And then they have that little gold coloring at the eye end that makes it just a little bit easier to stitch. But not everybody is like that, and so you're perfectly justified in using any needle that best fits your purpose. And in this case, you might try a size 12 applique needle, super fine, but the eye is just plain steel color, and it's going to be fine if you've got really good eyesight and can thread that. In every case, I have chosen for my comfort in hand stitching a medium to long length of needle. I just find that my hands get cramped if I use super, super short needles, but that is something for you to discover when you're doing your own hand stitching. So the bluntness or sharpness of the point, the thickness of the gauge, the length of the needle itself, and then finally we come to the size of the eye itself. And so I was talking about these size 10s, John James needles, having a gold eye because the eye itself is quite small and I can pass really fine thread through that and keep my stitches fine. But as the days get dim near the evening, I find that the lighting has to be just perfect for me to be able to hand stitch. So in the evening, I go to my big, longer eye embroidery needles, and I trust those ones to allow me to still have a really fine hand stitch, but it lets me thread that needle with a little bit more ease and doesn't cause a lot of eye strain. So I can keep sewing right into the evening, even in light that's not quite so good. The next thing a hand stitcher might want to consider is the fatigue that's placed on your fingers and your pushing finger and your pulling fingers when you're actually doing repeated hand stitching. I have in the past used, and still do, use this little leather thimble that places a little disc of plastic right under the leather where your finger that's going to be pushing is placed, and so I can repeatedly push on the very, very fine end of even a size 10 beading needle, and that doesn't come through to my finger. But I'm finding that with my embroidery work and my English paper piecing, I'm really starting to prefer these little leather spots. They're adhesive. The adhesive is just phenomenal. I place it on my finger right to protect the area where I push with my finger. I don't push with the center of the pad of my finger. I just naturally push right there. And so this takes the repeated pushing of the eye of that needle and doesn't allow the eye to back up into the skin on my finger. These little adhesive bands or leather strips can be used over and over and over again. And so you'll find that if you just take it and place it in some place where you know you've put it, you will be able to pick it up and use it again time after time. For those that don't feel there's enough protection with the little leather pad, you could actually buy, by the same company, you can buy little metal domes, one that's texturized and one that's plain, and then attach them to your finger with these little adhesive circles that are replaceable. And again, reusable time after time. I just love the dexterity and the eye-hand coordination that I get with just this little dot on my finger in leather. And I find I even forget that it's there. I just, walk around with it and I realize it's left on my finger. For some of you, hand stitching, the discomfort associated with prolonged hand stitching actually isn't the pushing the needle through, it's the cramping that you get trying to hold your fingers tight enough around the edge of the needle to pull it through. So this little product is very much worth a try. They again are just going to adhere to your fingertips, and you could put one on your thumb and one on your forefinger, and it will help you grip the needle to pull it through. So this has proved very useful when I've been working on leather, making slippers. Pulling that needle through is harder actually than sending it through. Getting it to come through with that heavy thread on it is made much more easy when I can grip the needle from the front and really, really grab onto it. So something to just protect your fingers is a good idea, and then you can prolong your hand sewing well beyond the time that your unprotected hand would be able to go. I'm super thrilled that our Orophil embroidery floss has arrived in the store. I'm really keen on working more and more with Orophil. I'm really liking their sewing machine threads, and so I'm really keen to try working these new Egyptian cotton flosses into some of my embroidery work, and including putting little embroidered pieces into my English paper piecing. You'll notice that the Orophil embroidery floss looks like a spool of thread. It comes on a really beautiful little wooden spool, and it's wound around. When you open up the plastic protective casing around it, you'll find a little tail of thread that lets you easily start unwinding this embroidery floss. Like other embroidery flosses that are 100% cotton, made of super long fibers, that's what Orophil prides itself on, is the length of its fiber, giving this thread the lint-free effect so that repeated passes through a textile or repeated washings are going to protect or keep that thread in its really, really beautiful lustrous state. This is just typical 6-strand embroidery floss. You'll notice it looks a little different. It doesn't look quite as fluffy as threads that you might get on an ordinary skein of embroidery thread. That's actually to the advantage of this thread. It's keeping all of those little fiber ends curtailed, keeping them inside, protecting them from the abrasion of the other fibers in the other strands or in the other skeins. So you want to treat Orophil like an ordinary embroidery thread, but you want to divide it up correctly before you use it. A typical length of embroidery cotton or floss should be somewhere between 12 to 18 inches. You're simply holding your elbows at your sides and you're measuring out a good length of thread that's going to pass through the fabric a number of times, but not so many times that you wear it out. And that's true of any hand stitching thread. So this piece that I've got that's about 14 inches long, I'm going to cut it with a pair of sharp snips. I don't want to chew through those fiber ends. I want to actually snip them off. And then to divide this thread, I am going to find all 6 strands and just hold that loosely between my thumb and forefinger on my non-dominant hand. And with my dominant hand, I'm going to start gently pulling the thread through. You'll notice a little bundle of the yarn is still building up there, but as I go gently through, it's not tangling, it's just drawing it up. And once that comes out, that strand comes out, all of this lays flat again and there's no tangles in it. So I'm just going to repeatedly draw my individual strands out. So I'm separating these to make sure that they have the chance to just kind of open up and lay a little fluffier because they're held quite rigidly down to the spool. They'll do better coverage for you when you're actually doing your stitches. So I'm just pulling apart my 6 strands, and then in the case of building whatever project it is I'm going to do, I'm going to thread three strands. That's my most common use that I have. But you might be doing 2 thread cross stitch or 1 thread embellishment around the edges and doing the back stitching on a cross stitch piece. So my 6 strands are now out from each other and they are no longer so rigidly put together into the strand. And then I'm just going to build my 3-strand structure again, and I'm just going to lay them even and smooth the thread down, and that is ready to go. I don't want to waste that other set of 3 strands, so just right away I am going to pick those up and prepare them so I can use them immediately when I run out of this grouping. And I'm just going to use the thread spool to control them for me. You remember how that thread was wound into the top end of the spool to keep it held in place so it didn't unwind. So that's what I'm going to do with my other 3 strands. I'm just going to lay them together and stick them into that little crease there, and now they're safe, they're not going to fly away, and they're ready to go. When I'm threading this needle, and so I wouldn't expect that I could thread 3 strands of embroidery floss into the regular eye of a hand stitching needle. So I am using an embroidery needle. In this case, I believe I have a size 7, which is just 1 step larger than the size 9. And I want to make sure that I give myself every opportunity to pass those threads through quickly and easily without having to spend a lot of time. So there's a number of techniques that you can use, but I find this one is really helpful. I'll begin by dampening the end of the thread, and you can use, obviously I licked my finger there, but don't let anybody else lick your thread. And then I'm going to use a very sharp pair of embroidery scissors that's going to cut through those yarns without chewing on them. It's going to just snip them very, very clear and clean. And I'm also taking what is imagining a 90-degree angle across the thread. Rather than 90 degrees, I'm going to slip at an angle, and that's going to provide me with one of those yarns that's in the lead and some that are in behind. So after that, I have 2 mechanisms that I use. I either pinch those very tightly between my thumb and forefinger on my non-dominant hand and use my dominant hand to drive the threads through the eye of the needle. That worked quite well. Or I take my needle and at the eye end, I fold the thread over the eye end and pinch it, draw the eye out, and I have a really super fine fold of thread there, and I push that through the eye of the needle. Those two techniques work most often for me. I'm getting ready to tie a knot in my thread. Some people don't tie knots, and that's fine. That's you that has to discover that for yourself, how you're going to do that. I like to, if I'm just doing plain embroidery work, I definitely want a knot in the end of my thread. You can tidy that up if you want. And here are a couple of ways you can make an easy knot in your thread. One way is to simply hold the needle in one hand and the thread end in the other and make a circle of them, laying the end of the thread on the length of the needle. So they're just coming in, forming a circle, and I'm laying that thread end on the needle. I hold this with my dominant hand, and with my non-dominant hand, I wind the thread around the needle 3 or 4 times. I then, with my non-dominant hand, just lightly pinch that and release my dominant hand. So I've got my little tail sticking out there, my winds around the needle. And now with my dominant hand, I'm ready to just push that needle through, keeping the tension on my thumb and forefinger. Those twists are being held in place until I can draw them right to the very bottom of the thread. So I've made a pretty small knot. If I don't like that tail on the end, then I can clip that tail off, or I can leave it on and trim it later. So that's one way to knot your thread. That involves, though, using both hands. You sort of have to have both hands free to do that. I like this other way as well, where I just simply pinch the thread between the thumb and forefinger of my non-dominant hand, wrap it around my forefinger, and make sure I cross it underneath my thumb. So there's a little cross in the thread. Then, with this thumb pressing onto this forefinger, I'm going to draw these, or sort of roll my thumb and my forefinger together by sending my forefinger down my thumb, creating a kind of twisting effect on these yarns. And so there's all those twists. I can lay them on the pad of my thumb, and then I can use my middle finger to draw it back. So I'll just do both of those techniques quickly again, and then you can stop action your video if you want. Needle threaded, thread end, needle end, bring them together to form a circle, grab onto it, wind with your non-dominant hand, hold onto it gently, just pinching those twists on the needle, push through, and bring right back to the end of the thread, and then nip off that little tail end if you don't like it. Or wrap the thread around the forefinger of your non-dominant hand, making sure there's a cross in it, and then pull that thread into twists by winding your forefinger or rolling your forefinger down your thumb, and then taking those twists and catching them with your middle finger between the pad of your thumb and your middle finger, and pull them down. So you'll get a decent knot, and it will be quickly and easily done rather than trying to figure out how you're going to do it if manipulating the thread with both hands. Everyone is aware for their embroidery work, they know about a hoop that will keep your fabric nice and tight so that when you lay down the stitches, it doesn't draw the fabric into little pinches or folds. You also know that when using an embroidery hoop, your hand underneath is what's being used to push that needle back through. So you have the ability to make stitches in various lengths, just depending on how your finger is pushing the stitches back through. Well, there are some projects for embellishment that may not be suitable for an embroidery hoop. And one example is this little knit glove that you could embroider some embellishment on, but you're not going to be able to put that into an embroidery hoop. So I've been trying this little new Clover product called the Stitch Dome. And what this is going to do for you is it's going to provide you a firm surface that you're going to be able to work your stitches on, but it's going to help you in place of your fingers being on the back, and it's going to also allow you to send your stitches up to a certain length. The domed feature of it, rather than being flat, the fact that it is a dome will then drive the needle upward when you make a stitch. It will help you actually place those stitches correctly. So I would not be able to put this little glove into an embroidery hoop, but I can certainly put the stitch dome inside. And if I was actually going to make the matching one to this, I would set it in here. And at this point, it's provided me with enough of a platform that I can do my stitches. I could use it without the little band around it, or I can place the band around it, and it will keep that definitely into a strict position where I've put it on. So I'm just placing my band on, and then I would be ready to stitch where my needle will be under control and directed as I make those stitches. When I go to make my stitches, here's the bottom of my glove. I can send my needle in, and then the fact that the dome is in there protecting my underneath fingers, it's going to help direct my needle upward, and I can make whatever stitch it is that I want to make. In this case, I would start without a knot. I'd make a few stitches in the same position, and my hand under here can support my work, but I can continue to make my stitch, and it will provide me with that expanded, firm setting for my fabric and no distortion in my little glove when I'm done my stitches. I've also found that it's been very useful for putting into, if you were going to embellish a garment, for example, you would not be able to stitch around the edge of this sleeve with your stitches before you hemmed it, because you wouldn't know the exact location of them. So after the hem is on, then you can place the stitch dome in, and again, depending on where it is on your sleeve, it will be really easy to put the band into position. If you can hold the rest of the fabric in a circle around underneath it, you can then place the little holder of the band and just kind of pull it with your fingers, and it will easily go on and give you that tension that you need to make your stitches. So that was easy. It's a little more tricky when you want to put it on the very edge of the thing. So I found when I was doing around the edge of a neckline like this, I wanted to put my stitch dome in here and then make a recurring set of little daisy stitches to make a little floral embellishment around the neckline of this shirt. And when I went to put my stitch dome on, that's great, I could put it on, and maybe it was just because I was new using it, I just felt that once I got my stitch dome on, I wasn't exactly sure where I was to be stitching my actual pattern. So I chose then to mark the placement of where I wanted my stitches before I put the stitch dome on. And by doing that, then it wouldn't matter how this fabric got moved around when I was actually putting the stitch dome into position. So with those markings there, I know that once I've got it on, I can just go ahead and make those stitches because that's exactly where they're going to be. So it was a simple matter of taking what I like best as a marker, these little disappearing air-soluble purple pens, made my markings to remind myself where my stitches are going to go, and slip on the stitch dome, and I'm ready to stitch. Again, I would probably start in the middle without a knot and then just cover over that area with all of the thread that I want to use. The first thing I used with my stitch dome was to actually repair a pair of hand knit socks. While I wouldn't spend any time repairing socks that I get from Superstore, 3 for $10 or whatever, it's certainly worth it to me to repair a pair of hand knit socks. So this stitch dome was actually the very first time I used it. I used it to repair this set of socks, and it's going to provide me with the surface that's going to help my needle move upward. It's going to be a secure, tight surface, and I can just hold on to the sock around it. I can also put the band on if that's what I want, to easily hold it into position, and then I can set it down. So I think this stitch dome is going to be a useful addition to my hand stitching tools. And one last thing, for those of you that are doing English paper piecing and are finding these glue stick pens to be extremely useful, they are really nice. They give you a very fine line of glue, but they do run out. So you need to know that there are refills, and they're very, very easy to put the refill in. Once you've used all of the glue in a particular piece, you wind your glue stick right up to the very top, and you will see a little gray or colored plastic piece that was basically the base of the first glue stick that you had in there. You've wound this up as high as it will go. You'll remove that little plastic piece, and when you open up your refill for the glue stick, that's the first thing you'll see at the very edge at the top of your glue stick refill, that little gray piece. You're just going to put that on to that holder that's on the main glue stick itself, and then wind the glue stick down as if you were going to close it up and put it away for the day. Just wind it down, and what that will do is carry the glue stick refill down into your pen, and you can see it's coming in and winding down. So it's very slick and easy refill process, and you're good to go for your next round of basting, glue basting. So I hope this was a useful bit of information for you. Just a quick review. When you're choosing your needles for hand stitching, make sure you consider the sharpness of the point, the thickness of the actual needle itself or its gauge, the length of the needle, and the size of the eye. And varying those factors can make your hand stitching experience a little more pleasant. Protect your fingers with some sort of a thimble or feature that will make it easier for you to continue hand stitching on a long-term basis. Maybe it's a leather pad, maybe it's a metal covered pad to protect the tips of your fingers, or maybe it's something to reduce fatigue by being able to pull the needle and thread through your fabric a little easier. Try the new Orophil thread. These threads are going to be able to be available in the 270 colors that Orophil makes. We stocked the store with the top 50 selling colors, so we already have a huge variety. And also Orophil has devised a conversion chart so that when you have another brand of thread or you have a cross-stitch pattern or whatever marked with other brands' numbers, we have a conversion chart that's available for you to be able to make that conversion. And remember that while the thread comes on a spool, it's going to be readily turned into a soft fabric covering spool or thread. And know that our spools are holding 18 yards of thread. That's a significant increase in the amount of thread compared to what you would get on a skein. Really high quality Egyptian cotton long strand fiber threads that are really, really lint free. They're going to perform very well in your projects. Remember that the glue sticks are easily refillable, and we can supply you with those. And then maybe give a try to this stitch dome if you are finding that you've got some projects that you want that are not suitable for an embroidery hoop. You might find the stitch dome is the answer to your problem of keeping your fabric stable and steady while you sew. Happy hand stitching, everybody!